You know when you get that quick toot of the horn and wave from a fellow motorist that's driving the same thing as you? I just got that from a hearse. Oh, I might never live this down. Hello everybody, today on the channel, it's the car your mother always dreamed of, you laid awake at night praying that your father would never buy, and your mechanic threatened to kill you if ever you got one for yourself. This is a 1979 Rolls Royce Silver Shadow 2. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, when it comes to Rolls Royces, the old ones, they all kinda blend into one. But there is a good chance if you mention old Rolls Royce to anybody, it's actually a Silver Shadow that they're thinking of. This was in production from 1965 until 1980, with some of its derivatives being in production for a few years after. It is the most numerous of all Rolls Royces ever made, with over 30,000 having left the factory at Crewe. And for a very, very long time, it was the wedding car of choice for your 1980s bride or groom. And you can see the picture now, can't you? There's mum with hair like Kylie and dad looking worryingly like he should be on some kind of register because it was the 80s and that's how people looked. And somewhere in the background was a white Rolls Royce Silver Shadow. And the fact is that it is for that reason that so many a young lad was desperate for their father not to buy one. Because when he was a young lad, yes, it may have been a super cool car, a very expensive and prestigious one. In 1979, this would have cost £23,000, the same as a Countach or 10 Polos. But by the time people like myself were a teenager, they had already got to the point where they were dirt cheap. You could pick one of these up for a couple of grand. And they looked exactly like you might imagine a couple of £1,000 Rolls Royce to look. They were okay at 20 paces and on camera, but get close and you could see the brush strokes. Many of them didn't even start life being white, but they got colour changed because that is what the bride expected. And then, even worse, when people tired of white Rolls Royces and instead started hiring VW campers to go to their nuptials, well, they got even tattier. And I think that's partly because for many owners, that semi-annual ritual of taking somebody out to their wedding was how they paid for the upkeep of the car. And as you might imagine, an old Rolls Royce is not a cheap thing to keep going. And because many of them languished for a very, very long time, today a lot of them still need a fair bit of work. And that is why your mechanic will threaten to divorce you, or worse, if you buy one. Because though, yes, you would certainly spend a lot of money with him, I think you can put a price on sanity. But let's put that aside for one moment. What exactly is it about the Rolls Royce Silver Shadow that made it such a special and popular car? First off, in terms of styling, it was a radical departure for the firm. Compared with the outgoing Silver Cloud, which by 1965 was in its third generation, this really was a complete break with tradition. Those look very much like the 1950s car that they are, but this, I guess you would say, is more a 1970s car, with certainly hints of 1960s about it, and today it's got a little bit of that timeless look you probably want from a classic Rolls Royce. As the majority of customers for their cars were still in Britain, where the roads are narrow and traffic in cities was beginning to become an issue, this car is 3.5 inches narrower than its forebear and 7 inches shorter. Yet, in spite of that, it has more room in it. And today, it's not actually an enormous car anymore, with these being just under 5.2 meters long. So about the same length as a Jaguar XJ. Rolls-Royce were able to achieve this by switching from a more traditional construction to a far more modern unitary one. The live axle of the old car was also replaced with an independent rear, and the car gained disc brakes at all 4 corners, with twin calipers up the front, officially for redundancy, though today it is often viewed instead as twice as much to go wrong. Though I have to say, the car does stop really rather well. I've not exactly been pushing it, but you tap that brake pedal and they really do work. And that's due in part to the fact that these brakes and this suspension is a setup that Rolls-Royce borrowed from Citroën. It is the same oleo-pneumatic setup as you would have found on the DS and many other cars of the day, because Rolls-Royce wanted a car that rode well, and the Citroëns were the best in the world. Put your foot down at a junction and it does respond fairly well. We'll then get up to 60 reasonably briskly, all courtesy of that classic Rolls-Royce L Series V8, which in the beginning displaced 6.25 litres, later in 1969 becoming the familiar 6.75. Although, as was tradition for the time, Rolls-Royce never gave official figures for the car's output, instead merely stating it was adequate. In the same way that Bose don't like to give specifications for any of their audio equipment because they knew if they did, you'd never buy any of it. This, I am told, makes something like 189 horsepower, which even then wasn't exactly masses for the amount of engine that sits up front. To give you some context, there would have been plenty of Ferraris and Lamborghinis of the day that were making comfortably over 300 from less. And though yes, they were sporting 12 cylinders, this was still a very, very expensive car, only costing marginally less than the Ferrari 512 BBI. And if you were to look at the Mercedes catalogue, the only thing even close in terms of price was the mighty 450 SEL 6.9. In fact, the only other car that I found for sale which would have cost more was a Panther, which I don't think I've ever seen in my entire life. The Silver Shadow 2, what I am driving today, appeared in 1977, being in production for just 3 years until the model was discontinued in 1980. But still, it brought with it several notable improvements, including, perhaps most significantly, the introduction of rack and pinion steering. And I have to say, for a big old bus, it is actually a very pleasant thing. The older cars with their steering box are very frustrating affairs. You're making constant adjustments, and that means that sometimes they're not the relaxing drive that you expect them to be. This though, I must say, I'm having a really, really good time in. And let's take a moment to admire not just the looks, but this absolutely spectacular colour combination. Stuart has picked a blinder with this car, and he's owned it for nearly 24 years now, having picked it up in 2001. At the time it was in reasonable condition, but had been laid up for a while, so needed really what you'd call a recommissioning. The colour scheme is green larch over Scots pine, and I absolutely love it. In here it is a more classic combination of wood and your nice leather with very thick carpets, and you even have seat belts up the front, proper nice 3.1s, though in the rear you got nothing. Such was the case at the time. We have a bevy of old school gauges, no rev counter mind, and we even have air conditioning, which I am delighted to say works. You also have electric adjustment for the seats and the windows, though I can never remember which is which. And I tell you what, they go up and down pretty quick for an old car. Very often you get in these things and they just go, and they're not happy at all, but this feels great. It is that brake pedal which is taking the most getting used to, because I've just gotten out of a McLaren which has a very firm pedal that needs a real good solid press, and this needs only the lightest of touches. However, once you get used to it, you can bring the car very smoothly to a stop. Wonderful thing. Now, in the early days of production, these cars were available with either a 4-speed gearbox, which apparently dated back to the 1950s, or a 3-speed turbo hydromatic, courtesy of General Motors. that was the only option ever given to left-hand drive customers, but as time went on, the 4-speed was actually phased out, meaning by the time this was built, the only option was the 3. And though it does an okay job, I'm fairly confident it's not the most efficient thing going. And that might be part of the reason why these cars are tragic on fuel. By which I mean, if you get 13 out of this, owners would consider that hypermiling. And this is not actually the first time I've sat in or even driven a Silver Shadow. You'll have never seen this, but a long time ago my old buddy Laurie called me and said, "James, do you want a cheap Rolls Royce?" And I said, "No, of course not. I'm not stupid. I know there is nothing more expensive than a cheap Rolls Royce." And at this point in time, the channel was not making any money at all. A week later he phoned me and said, "James, do you want a free Rolls Royce?" And I said, "Absolutely not. No way, not a chance." It then transpired that what was going on was that a friend of his had a brother or brother-in-law who'd had a Silver Shadow for some time, white as you might imagine, not in spectacular condition, but that ran. He'd previously used to tow a caravan, but now he unfortunately couldn't drive it, but also they didn't want to sell it. It being a relatively large car, they wanted somewhere else to store it, and the deal was, you guys take it, have it, if something happens we'll sort it, but you know, just use it, drive it, enjoy it. On the 2 occasions that I went to go and move it, I recall getting in it, putting it into drive, and then being leant back like so, putting it into reverse, and then being thrust forward like so. This one actually is in far better nick for sure. It's not anywhere near as bad though. That gearbox, that's not very luxurious, is it? And on all of the occasions I saw that car try and move, it leaked a new and interesting fluid. It was just not an enjoyable experience, that. I do believe at one point Laurie did manage to take it out and do, of course, a wedding run with it. And I remember my dad telling me that he'd spotted Laurie out and about, and he managed to keep up with him for a good 15 minutes. Remarkable mostly because my father was on a bicycle. They also had to make an unexpected stop because it was so wallowy that one of the bridesmaids was sick. And so, as you can imagine, after that, I thought that anything and everything I'd ever believed about Rolls Royces was true. They're not that nice to drive, but they do break and will cost a fortune and are simply misery. This is why when I was a lad, there was no car you wanted your dad to have less than a Rolls. Because not only was it old hat, old man, pipe and slippers, fuddy-duddy, but it was also the car that was bought by people who wanted to look like they had lots of money when in fact they had none. And that is awful and terrible and a horrid thing to say, but that is how the mind of a 13-year-old works. And you know as well as I do, you probably felt that way at that age about a lot of other things. Now though, I have a lot of respect for the Rolls-Royce owner who takes a car such as this, keeps it in remarkable condition. This has to be one of the cleanest and tidiest Silver Shadows I have seen in a very, very long time. And although it's not my thing, I tell you something, it is really, really quite delightful. Because it is fairly narrow and because you can see, well, basically all of that bonnet, including the traditional Spirit of Ecstasy front and centre, it is really easy to place and to drive. It's also very, very comfortable. It creaks a lot. I think this car would benefit greatly from a liberal dose of both leather moisturiser and maybe some Gummipflege too. But these seats are wondrous. Ooh, yeah, there we go, brush past my camera. Steering, nice, light, and yet still somehow communicative, perhaps courtesy of those very narrow and tall tyres, which would have been common back in the day. What's maybe most remarkable about these is that where the fortunes of many other cars have changed over the last decade, I checked Auto Trader this morning and you could still pick up a Silver Shadow from less than £10,000, with good examples now commanding a fair bit more. So if you do decide to give it a go, what are you letting yourself in for? Well, now I'm on my favourite little bit of B-road. I'm going to put my foot down as much as the car will permit. and try and talk to you about the dynamics of the thing, as inappropriate as that might be. Now, body roll is the order of the day, and in all honesty, I'm not really feeling an issue with that engine. Yes, I know it is desperately underpowered for a 2.1 plus ton car, but the suspension means that I think even if it did have twice the power, I'm not sure you could do masses with it. There we go, that's 40, 50, and there's 60. Very lollopy thing, but you know what? So regal. I love the reaction you get from people in this car, not just the funeral directing community, but the general public. They love this thing. I think the colour's probably got quite a bit to do with it. As soon as I saw the picture of this, I thought, you know what, sod it, I've got to give this a go. And I've actually, over the years, driven a few of this car's successors. So the Silver Spirit, which followed on from it, then also the Silver Seraph that came after that, and even a Phantom 7. I've also then driven a Wraith, which is a separate lineage. And the Wraith, actually, you could call a modern incarnation of one of the many spin-offs from this car. So not only did you have this, the Silver Shadow and Silver Shadow 2, they also did an extended wheelbase version, later dubbed the Silver Wraith, which was considerably more expensive. There was then the Corniche, available as either a hardtop coupe or a convertible, and one of the most expensive cars of its day, the Camargue, a Pininfarina designed two-door coupe, which I do believe commanded not quite double, but something like £15,000 more than this. Remember, list price 23 grand, Camargue more like 40. That was serious money. That's more than a lot of people's houses at the time. In fact, quite a bit more. It just makes me happy, this thing. It just really, really does. I've not really got any interest in putting my foot down any more than I need to. You get that faint, distant V8 rumble, and it's a lovely thing. Only 61,000 miles on the clock. This year, apparently, the car has seen more service than in any other, partly because it is now in better condition than it ever has been, partly because, thanks to my good friend Brad, who came up with Stuart this morning, he has now found a workshop that can get things done, and in relatively good time. That's Silver Lady, down in Essex somewhere. And companies like that are really, really important for owners of things like this, because without them, let's be honest here, well, you just couldn't keep the cars on the road. And the longer they're off the road, the more things will go wrong with them, even if you're not using them. And that means as and when someone does come to try and use it, there'll be an even bigger bill awaiting them. And that's how we wind up in this silly cycle of one of the formerly most expensive cars in the world being one of the cheapest. I mean, you can pick one of these up for less than the price of a nice Mini. And that's just madness, isn't it? I think for me today, these cars have now just about passed through that awkward window where they're not just rubbishy and slightly old, they're now proper classics. And in fairness, they probably were when I was a kid. I was just an awful child, and I'd have been far more excited about somebody turning up in an M5 than a Rolls Royce, because I was all performance orientated and I didn't appreciate the craftsmanship that went into stuff like this. And on that front, I have to say that other than the stalks here, which do feel not naff actually, that's not fair at all. Some of the later Bentleys that I've driven, they were a bit worse, the turbo and so on, and there was a Bentley version of this as well, of course, the T-Series. At the time the two companies were connected. You just look at this thing, turning circles really good. Yeah, really, really good. And all the gauges, they look nice, they look decent. They're Jaeger dials for at least the speedo. Everything in here seems to work. I've got no unexpected warning lights. Even the temperature gauge is accurate. Even the clock is correct. Love also the period radio down here with a cassette player a little further down below the vents. And it's all really rather pleasant, this. Still getting used to those brakes. The steering is delightful. The visibility is absolutely sensational because all of the pillars are paper thin. So even though the B is close to you, well, it basically vanishes on account of us humans having binocular vision. It's great. I actually quite like this. I often think about buying a Bentley just because it seems like a daft idea. I want to call it a good idea. It's not a good idea, is it? Flying spur, something like that, and occasionally I start looking at Mulsannes or Arnages or things like that, and then I remember that, no, I'm trying to save money and economise and shrink the fleet at the minute and be a sensible adult. But then you go, yeah, but look at it. Look at how wondrous it is. I mean, this would be an awesome car to take into London. This is £12.50 and £15 of ULEZ and congestion charge. Very well spent. Stuart tells me this is his one and likely only ever Rolls Royce, and when I asked him what it was that drew him to it, he said, well, that's simple. His grandfather was always a Rolls man. He recalls him picking up a new Shadow in 1975, and at the time he was given this keyring. Very special little plastic number specifically made out of that material so it doesn't scrape the dash. Apparently, the Rolls-Royce garage weren't keen on giving his grandfather a second one until he said, well, that's fine, but I won't buy the car if you don't give me two. Always confused why dealers are that way. Fight over a, what wouldn't have been a pound keyring back then, would it? Probably been a, 50p one. All for a £24,000 car. But that is where it all began. And I always love hearing stories like that, and it's amazing to see him then having such a good example of the breed. This really does both him and Rolls-Royce a credit. And I suspect it is fair to say that with these, in terms of what can go wrong, well, everything. They are in some cases 60-year-old, almost handmade British cars that have spent decades being very cheap handmade British cars. The parts are generally, I think, available, but they're not always that cheap, and the labour is always going to be the killer because they're big and complicated cars. But I think if you do either buy a good one or a project and know what you're letting yourself in for, and of course always budget a little more than you expected, over time one of these would probably be a relatively good thing to have. It's always going to be special, it's always going to be interesting, it's always going to be a Rolls Royce. And I think maybe for me with this, just the colour alone entirely erases that stigma of the cheap, naff, old wedding car. And you know what? I'll tell you how this car makes me feel. Sometimes when I'm doing my review and I've finished saying what I have to say, if it's a spicy, sporty car, I'll put my foot down one last time, see what it's got. But with this, you know what I want to do? I want to get the radio on. See if I can get classic FM.
In order to try and understand, who their partner is. And so they start every Indian wedding with a series of games.
Life is good. Well, there we go. I want to say a huge thank you to Stuart and Brad for coming out today, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.